Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you all had a wonderful Easter and enjoyed your time as best as you possibly can in these circumstances and these days that we're experiencing. However, it's good to have you back. Um, and what we're going to do this week is we're going to finish up our discussion of plants, okay? And as I said to you in the last video that you watched last week, we're going to focus today on flowering plants. All right. Flowering plants, if you remember from our discussion in, I think it was the second video, we talked about there were two types of vascular plants, and they were the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. And the gymnosperms were the cone-bearing plants, and they're the oldest type of vascular plant. They're very numerous, okay, but they're the oldest type of vascular plant. The angiosperms is the most common type of vascular plant, and angiosperms, if you remember, they all produce flowers. And I had said in that video that all angiosperms produce flowers, and all plants that produce flowers also produce fruits of some sort. All right? Now, with angiosperms, there are two types of angiosperms, and these two types are called the monocots and the dicots. Now, monocot is short for monocotyledon. So monocots are flowering plants that in their seeds have one cotyledon. Dicots is short for dicotyledons. And so all dicot angiosperms have two cotyledons in their seeds. Now, if you go back to the first video on plants that we did, I believe it was the first one or it was the second one, we talked about the parts of the seed. And the cotyledons are the food source for the developing plant, for the embryo. Okay? So monocots have one cotyledon, dicots have two cotyledons. That's the main difference between the two types of angiosperms, all right? The number of cotyledons that's found in their seeds, either one or two. However, there are many differences between monocots and dicots. The main one is the number of cotyledons. But let's take a look at some of the other differences you have between monocots and dicots. All right, you can see here dicots there on the top row, monocots there on the bottom row, that there are several differences between these plants. And you can tell the differences between these plants when you look at their leaves and you look at their flowers and their roots and all kinds of good stuff, okay? But the dicots, all right, the ones that have two cotyledons in their seeds, as you can see there, there's like a bean, all right, that's their seeds, they have two cotyledons. But the other differences that they have is for dicots, you have pollen grains that have 3 pores or furrows in them. The flowers, parts of the flower, occur in multiples of 4 or 5, and that includes all parts of the flower. We're going to be looking at the flowers and the different parts of the flower, but all parts of the flower, specifically petals and stamen, all right, occur in multiples of 4 or 5. The leaves are usually oval or palmate, and they have net-like veins, okay? So it's a netted venation, if you remember the diagrams on the leaf, on the shapes of the leaf and the types of venation that they have, all right? The vascular bundles are arranged in a ring in the stem, so if you have a dicot and you break open the stem, you would see that the vascular bundles are arranged in an orderly fashion in a ring, all right, through the stem. And dicots also tend to have tap roots. All right, now monocots, on the other hand, if you look on the bottom there, all right, they have pollen grains that have 1 pore or furrow. The seeds, and that looks like a corn kernel, have only 1 cotyledon. Their flower parts occur in multiples of 3. Their leaves are narrow with parallel veins. All right, the vascular bundles are just kind of scattered throughout the stem. They're not arranged in an orderly fashion, and they tend to have fibrous roots, okay? Now, one monocot that's very common at this time of year, and you may even have a couple of them in your house, would be Easter lilies, all right? Especially, you can tell by looking at their leaves. They have long, narrow leaves with parallel veins. But if you also counted, like, the number of petals on an Easter lily, you would find that they would occur in multiples of 3. So there's going to be like 3, 6, or 9 petals on each of the lilies. All right? However, the key thing for you to understand with the difference between monocots and dicots, hence their name, is the number of cotyledons that are found in their seeds. Okay, two cotyledons versus one cotyledon. Now, one thing that they all have in common, however, is that their flowers are their reproductive structures. If you remember with gymnosperms, you have the male cone, which tends to be the longer, thinner ones, and then you have the female cones that tend to be the fatter ones that are more open than the male cones are, and that's to allow the pollen to go in and fertilize the eggs. All right, in a flower, the male parts and the female parts are all included within the same structure. All right, so let's take a look then at this structure of these flowers and the different parts of the flowers. All right, here's a diagram of the same, pretty much the same basic flower that we looked at on the previous slide. However, the different parts are labeled this time around. So let's start taking a look at the parts of these flowers. All right, the first part that you have labeled is A, all right, and that's on the bottom of the flower there. And those are the sepals. Those are the leaf-like structures that will cover a developing bud. If you've ever seen a flower as it's budding, before the flowers open, you see that, the buds at the tip of the stems, and they're covered by these leaf-like structures. Those are the sepals. When the flowers are getting ready to open, the sepals will open up first before the petals start to open up. And the sepals actually stay attached, to the bottom of the flower. So they're actually there kind of as a base for the flowers underneath the flower once it opens up. The second part that you have labeled there is the letter B, and those are the petals. The petals are colorful. A lot of times they have a nice smell to them, okay, and they are designed in that fashion to attract pollinators. Pollinators are the insects, the birds, the small animals that transfer pollen for these plants. Okay, now the third part that you have labeled there is, that's part C, and that's the stamen. The stamen is the male organ of the flower, and the stamen has two parts to it. Okay, the first part of it is the very top of it, and that's called the anther, and that's where pollen is produced and stored. A lot of times you see these sticking up out of a flower, okay? And if you touch them, you get like a yellowish powder on your finger, greenish, sometimes brownish flower. Depends on the type of flower, which is the color of the pollen. That's the pollen that you're actually picking up by touching that anther, okay? Now, the anther is held up by a thin stalk that's called the filament. And if you notice in this particular diagram, there are 6 stamen and there's 3 petals. So we have flower parts that occur in multiples of 3s. All right, so this would be considered a monocot plant. Okay, likely this flower had 6 flowers. What we're looking at is a cross section, as if somebody cut this flower in half so you could look on the inside of it. All right, but likely there were 6 petals, 6 stamen. This would be a monocot flower. All right, then you have part D here, which is the pistil, also known as the carpel. Either word is perfectly fine to use to identify the female organ of the flower, all right, because that's what it is. Now, as opposed to the stamen, which has 2 parts, the pistil has 3 parts to it. We have the stigma, which is the very sticky top. We have the style, which is the tube that leads from the stigma down into the ovary. And then the ovary is the large bottom of the pistil, which contains the ovules. Okay? And that is also what becomes the fruit of the flower. All right? So the stamen is the anther, which produces the pollen and the filament. And the pistil is the stigma, the style, and the ovary. All right? Now, the stigma, notice I said there, it's a sticky top to the pistil. It's sticky so that the pollen will stick to it. All right, so when the wind blows or when an insect flies from flower to flower and it's depositing pollen on accident, all right, it actually will stick to the stigma, so that way it doesn't blow away, so fertilization can occur. And then, of course, you have the ovules, which are inside the ovary there of the pistil. All right, the ovules is just a fancy word for eggs. All right, the eggs of the flower. So, of course, fertilization occurs when the pollen fertilizes the eggs. All right, and we're going to talk a little bit about pollination. but that is what produces the seeds for these plants. Now, it doesn't matter if this is a monocot or a dicot. They all have the same parts to their flowers. They all have the sepals, they all have the petals, they have the stamen, and they have the pistils. It's just how many of them they have, what kind of multiples they occur in, will determine whether it's the flower of a monocot or a dicot. All right? Now, the process of pollination is when pollen from the anther is transferred to the stigma. All right? When this happens, a pollen tube will grow down from the stigma through the style to the ovary for fertilization. And basically what a pollen tube is it's extensions of cytoplasm that grow from the pollen grain, all right, for the sperm to pass through. All right, it's just a little passageway for the sperm in order for them to move down into the ovary in order to fertilize the ovules. Okay, and the fruit then develops from the ovary, and it surrounds and protects the seeds. Once fertilization occurs, the petals will fall off, the stamen will fall off, the sepals will fall off, and all pretty much you have left is the ovary of that flower. And then that ovary starts to grow and become fleshy, and it grows into what we know to be the fruit of that particular flower. Okay? Now, as I said before, back in the second video or the first video, the fruit will help in seed dispersal because as animals eat the fruit, all right, the seeds do not get digested. They pretty much come out the exact same way that they went in. And so when animals defecate, they will deposit these seeds everywhere. And it comes with its own fertilizer. And if the defecation is on ground, the seeds can begin to germinate, and this is where you have the dispersal of these plants all over the place. This is how you can have flowers that appear where you didn't plant the flowers before. This can be how you can have a tree grow where you didn't have a tree growing before, because the fruit is eaten by these animals, and they deposit the seeds a long distance from where they originally ate the fruit. All right. Now, as I said, pollination is primarily done by insects, birds, and small animals. All right. And pollination actually occurs in one of two ways. You can have self-pollination or you can have cross-pollination. Self-pollination is pollination that occurs within the same flower. All right, the anther the pollen from the anther of one flower falls upon the stigma of the same flower and grows the pollen tube down to fertilize the eggs within the ovary. Cross-pollination is when you have pollination occurring between two different flowers. So the pollen from one flower, it then falls upon the stigma of a different flower. And that's what's usually done with insects, birds, and small animals. A lot of times self-pollination occurs because of wind, all right, but it can also occur because of insects. If you notice, if you watch bees flying from flower to flower, every time they land on a flower, they're picking up pollen on their legs, and they actually have fur. And if the pollen falls on top of the stigma of the same flower while the bee is sucking the nectar out of the flower, then that's self-pollination. But if it falls on the stigma of a different flower, the next flower that the bee lands on, then that's where you have cross-pollination occurring. Cross-pollination also helps with the diversity of flowers, because you can have two different types of flowers possibly fertilizing and creating a new type of flower. Now, there are differences, all right, among flowers, believe it or not. Okay, you have what are called complete flowers, which are flowers that have petals, sepals, pistils, and stamen. And then you also have what are called incomplete flowers, where they lack either sepals or petals. Okay, you also have what's called a perfect flower, which is a flower that has both pistils and stamen. But then you also can have an imperfect flower in which they're lacking either the pistil or the stamen. So a lot of times cross-pollination will occur for these imperfect flowers in order for fertilization to happen, because imperfect flowers, they're lacking the pistil or they're lacking the stamen. So it has to be cross-pollination. There can't be any self-pollination occurring there. All right, and that kind of ends our discussion as far as the flowers are concerned. All right, in our next video, we're going to be talking about the uses of plants and why plants are important to humans, and as well as different ways that humans are working in which to improve plants. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of the flower. And it's kind of sad that we're not in school, because one of my favorite things to do with you guys in the lab is to go out and get some flowers and bring them in and have you rip them apart and take a look at the different flower parts, and determine for me, is this a monocot, is this a dicot, are these perfect flowers, are they imperfect flowers, are they complete flowers, are they incomplete flowers. But unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that this year. All right, so I'll see you in the next video.